gather round again, because I guess enough of you asked for it. And yes, I'm just as surprised as you are how many showed up last time. Also, if you came to just hate and leave, might I say that's just really childish, which I think is an insult to actual children. And I only bring that up because I know there are some people who do that. Not that I know it from happening to me, because it hasn't. I just know some people do it. Anyway, now that the people who came to actually watch it are bummed out, I'll barrage you all with my found knowledge on the background lore made from the past 1.16 update. Enough of you were so, spiritedly generous to give your own versions of the Minecraft lore and stuff, which is my way of saying very hubristically. Enough people were calling themselves right and everyone else not right, and before you say that's what I was doing, I was not. I'm simply comparing what other people said and realized there were a lot of plot holes, and what I said satisfied all the given information and came out with no plot holes. Though I will admit I got a little too preachy near the end of the video. That one's on me. Can I just be the first to say almost all you are really bad at being lore historians. Almost everyone's first mistake was not acknowledging that the Nether really is supposed to resemble Hell. In case you weren't aware, look at this. An unedited screenshot of the Nether history page on the official Minecraft wiki says it was based on / resemblant of Hell. There you have it. Now stop saying the Nether isn't supposed to resemble Hell, or even worse, the Nether isn't Hell, you loony. Of course the Nether isn't actual Hell. This is a video game. There is no media or game or anything that can truly captivate the essence of Hell, or really anything at all if you think about it. If anything were to actually accomplish that, it would be a really lame and unfun game because that's what they truly captivated. Kind of the equivalent of you get what you pay for. So that's why when they made the Nether, they based it on the whole fire and brimstone thing, because that's actually interesting and people will know what they mean, because everyone thinks of the hellscape looking like that, versus just void and terror, which I said in the last video, which is what Hell really is if we're talking about real Hell, which we are not because we're talking about a video game version of it. Now that wasn't very hard to comprehend, was it? So that's why they made the Nether like that. And now I present to you the sequel to my video complaining about how the 1.16 Nether update ruins Minecraft lore. I give the video explaining what the lore is like since the 1.16 Nether update happened. And just to clarify, my standing on that update hasn't changed a ton. I still disagree with what they did. I'll start out talking about the piglins, which I said at the very end of my last video I figured out were demons. Why? Because everything about them aligns about perfectly with demons. Pigs are generally associated with uncleanliness and impurity, which makes sense that the devs would do that. And also they, piglins, are the greediest and selfishest mobs in the game. Nothing else can compare. You can think otherwise, but realistically, sensibly, piglins are the worst. Greed is commonly said to be the worst of sins, though I disagree. I think it's pride, but I honestly would do the same thing, making them greedy. I think it's the easiest sin to interpret in a character to get the point across that they're rotten. You see it in Scrooge, Al from Toy Story 2, Scrooge McDuck, piglins? Okay, so there's not a lot of them. So what about their other characteristics? Why do they turn into zombie piglins when they leave the Nether? And furthermore, why are there any at all still in the Nether? Well, I'm just gonna say the developers left them in so veteran players wouldn't be as mad as if they removed them altogether, which they may as well have, talking from a lore searching view. But the lore reason why they are still in the Nether, I'd say, is because of their damnation. Clarification, demons are damned, just as damned as someone who went to hell after judgment, if not more. Now why do I say it's because of damnation? Because when a regular piglin walks out of the Nether, they turn into a zombie piglin. Which I will call them that because as much as I've gotten over the whole update, I cannot will myself to say their true, awful dev-given name, Zombified Piglins. It's just an awful name. Probably the worst thing they ever did on top of replacing their precursors. But that true name does kind of verify that all zombie piglins in the Nether are piglins that were turned undead at some point. Which we kind of know what that point is. It was whenever the time was that they left the Nether, likeliest. Like, if it were anything else, well, there's nothing to tell. But then what about the other Nether pig mobs, Hoglins? How come they can leave the Nether and they likewise turn into undead Zoglins, but we never see any in the Nether? That's because Hoglins are also damned. They are likelier the people who went to hell post-judgment versus demons who went to hell before even the first mortals. Thank you whoever it was that pointed that out last video. I probably would have figured it out on my own, but thanks anyway. But why do they turn undead when they leave the Nether in the first place? That's because of their whole damnation I mentioned earlier before I got sidetracked 1,000 times. A player can enter the Nether and leave with no consequence than the obvious, but because the pig mobs are damned, they now belong to the Nether, or really hell, more like, while in the Nether. I'm going to clarify that difference. Hell is the state they're in because they're damned, and the Nether is the hellscape setting they are stuck in because they're damned. Why their damnation is the reason they turn undead is because by being damned, they're in hell. This sounds redundant, but hear me out. If they tried to leave the Nether, all the hell that's otherwise spread thin around them while in the Nether now comes back to them in whole out of the Nether. There was technically never supposed to be an escape portal for them, so unexpected stuff like that happens. Maybe the Minecraft characterization of hellish damnation is being undead and trapped in the Nether. So while they'd be more alive than undead in the Nether, they're still technically supposed to be undead, if that's true. But why are they instead not undead at all anyway? I'll explain that later after explaining some other stuff. The question still remains, why are there zombie piglins in the Nether, but we see no zombie hoglins there? I think that reason is because piglins have been damned for longer and know better that they're really no better off out of the Nether than in it, because they'll be in hell no matter what. But hoglins, who've been there for significantly less time, will find any fate better than this, the better of two evils, and will not turn back to the Nether even if it means living out the rest of their existence as an abominable mobile corpse. Keep in mind, zombies, sentient or not, can't feel anything either, which is worse than you might think. And why don't we see them in the overworld? Imagine this, they are extra determined to hide. They wouldn't want anyone to see them, not even God if they could hide from him. That also explains why they'll attack any other mob they're confronted with, so no one else will get the news that they saw them. Except of course creepers, because that is certain suicide, and of course they wouldn't want to respawn in the Nether again, where they are endlessly hunted or imprisoned by piglins in a restless setting of fire and brimstone. Perhaps the knowledge of what happened if they left is why they avoid Nether portals. Zombie piglins, however, care much less about life or undeath, what with bigger fish to fry, or gold or whatever. There are no fish in the Nether. Whatever, you know what I mean. Likewise, we never see the iron golems that appear in villages because they also hide. What the heck am I talking about, you ask? Well, in case you didn't see my past video, which you probably should, I mean the iron golems that appear naturally in villages are actually ancient and have been roaming the world searching for more testificates to defend because that's what they were created for. Though since times have drastically changed much since, they get captured by the wrong ones every now and then. But that still explains why the naturally spawned ones are better at fighting than the manually spawned ones, who evidently have been around for less time. And you can tell they've aged much by the vines and moss growing on them, except the manually spawned ones also have that texture, which I can only explain with the developers haven't thought over that one. Seriously, this is the one thing I want them to change. There's no reason anyone can come up with why the manually spawned ones have nature on them, and it'd make distinguishing the two a bunch easier. But instead we got polar and panda bears, foxes, and bees. And this thing? You're telling me this is canon? Player experience, am I right? If you don't want to think anyone can hide that well, imagine all the mobs we all know only spawn in low enough light levels. According to what actually would go on inside the game, they had to be in the shadows before officially spawning, and just diffused into the dark openness we see them having spawned in. They were hiding too. Unfortunately, the game is imperfect and gets confused sometimes, and that's why they'll often spawn in your unlit basement. So if zoglins did naturally spawn, for the fact that they don't spawn in the Nether, and from what I just said, they would actually spawn in the overworld. Oh man, he's really gone off the rails on this one. No, he's actually got a point. So the thing with piglins and hoglins out of the Nether has been mostly solved, except why the undead ones don't burn in fire. And that's just because, think of it as you can only fit so much water in a glass, or even hell suffering in a certain vessel. They're already capped. About those soon after added piglin brutes are still demons, obviously, just much higher up in status. Probably war captains, the equivalent of a demonic legion legate. Their behavior, however, is strayed more from greed towards a maniacal war obsession. You can tell this because they are not distracted by shinies like the lesser piglins are, and they are much tougher, and better with an arm shield than really anyone else. This is canonly why they have so many hit points, and also why they don't equip armor. Now I'm going to point this out because I'm sure I'll otherwise have to reply to everyone's comments about it. Piglin brutes are not implied to be leaders, but it makes the utmost sense that they would be, and not just different piglins with an attitude. And they're non-renewable. They only spawn once, meaning there's a specific amount of them. They hang around in the Bastion remnants where other piglins also sit. The "those were the days" advancement is certainly referencing them in the Bastion ruins from their perspective. So what were the Bastions, and why are they ruined? Why are the piglins reminiscent to the days those were? I think because a Bastion is by definition a fortress built for defense, that at some time, maybe in the early days of their damnation, there was a conflict meriting enough to set up defenses of such magnitude, meaning probably a civil war. For all we know, this hypothetical war could still be going today, though we've never seen piglins ever fight other piglins, even if one shoots another in its back on accident, which makes me think a civil war may not have happened. But what else could it have been, unless after this separation they became really close with each other, even that they minimally care if a huntmate just shot them, then never finding another of another clan ever again? I think it's asking too much. I think it was some external force. Maybe the gigantic snakes I talked about last time, which we only see fossils of in the Soul Sand Valleys now. Though it makes more sense they've always been this way and nothing was ever alive here ever, because it's hell and a great representation of soul death. Perhaps a war with the returned undead piglins, explaining why the piglins avoid them, unless it really is just because they're hideous, which to me makes a hell of a lot more sense. And in retrospect, that even as an idea is just ridiculous. Probably even the wither could have been the reason. Which brings to mind, why don't we see the wither naturally? The naive, obvious answer is just because it's a big place. The odds of finding it just out and about is most remote, but certainly there must be a much better explanation than that. Like, what is the wither? And how come we call it the wither like there's only one when clearly you can spawn more than one at the same time? Now I'm gonna sorta go back on something I said in the last video, which supposed there was only one wither. But the fact that multiple health bars will appear if multiple withers are spawned implies there isn't supposed to be be just one. We probably say the Wither the same way we say the Kraken, which there could just be one Kraken. But seriously, unless it's a stranded alien that fell into the ocean from space, there's probably a whole species of them in the vast ocean. But of course, it may just not exist at all. The Wither is a characterization of everything true hell represents, which is death and destruction in the abyss. In my opinion, all collectively given the perfect name Wither. It even carries the core of the Nether Star. You know what other character also represents these same things? The demon Abaddon, or Abaddon, or Apollyon if you're Greek. You see him in the beginning of my Halloween video, though I never said who it was, but that is Abaddon. Abaddon is a demonic characterization of everything true hell represents, which is death and destruction and the abyss, just the same as the Wither, though the name means both the figurative demon and hell itself. It may or may not be a truly incarnate demon, I don't know. But there is just one of him and multiple Withers, which makes me think all the Withers work as a hive mind for Abaddon, like a bunch of puppets. So that means destroying one is the closest you'll ever get to fighting actual Satan, in case you were wondering. Likely if they ever were to add a Satan equivalent boss, it'd be a gigantic piglin king or something of the sort, not the Wither. Maybe even that mentioned but unimplemented red dragon. In the book of Revelations, oh kill me, another Bible reference. Shut up, dude. In the book of Revelations, it refers to the devil as a great red dragon, blah 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 blah. Either way, that's still something to work with. And if it ever is implemented, you'll probably get to fight Minecraft Satan. But at the moment, we're just up with Abaddon's puppets. If they ever added it, would I be fine with it? No. I think they'd be reaching way too far since we've already got the Ender Dragon and a pre-existing Nether boss, which also is a ruler of hell. They're both rulers of hell, certainly, just Abaddon is the master of death and destruction, whereas the devil is the master of all evil and corruption. The devil is in hell, Abaddon is it. Think of it this way, if the devil were the president, God help us, Abaddon would be the White House landlord, and the Withers would collectively be the White House itself and its security. And no, the Wither Storm is not Abaddon. The Wither Storm was a man-made entity given the name because of its relations to the Withers in both summoning and relative behavior. It's a drastically mutated by commands individual Wither. And also, I'm aware this part of the story could work without Abaddon, that it's just the Withers. I just have him in because, of course, the Withers have got to get their directives from somewhere. Even if it was from some other unheard character, it inevitably traced back to Abaddon. So relating back to what I said about piglins and the Bastion remnants and why the Wither may have been why they set them up, if that is the reason, then that explains why the piglins fight Wither skeletons, to prevent another Wither invitation. Maybe at some time the piglins managed to trap and seal away the Wither, or even Abaddon as a whole. Now the only way they could come back is the way we summon them now. Abaddon probably spoke from beyond to the damned skeletons, a way to get him back, kinda like the Call of Cthulhu, probably offering some fictitious reward to them, though eternal withering doesn't sound so great to me. And it's purely evil in all the right ways to ask for the souls of their vilest sinners and heads of their most devoted to summon them. But since both Abaddon and piglins are demons, why would they ever be fighting? Ask a stupid question. Even here, we humans fight all the time. Even still, what'd be the driving force there? Maybe, because remember, Abaddon is a demonic representation of hell. He was just doing his job, giving the perpetual hellish suffering to the damned like they deserved. Maybe at some point enough became enough and they overpowered him. And since then, because Abaddon wasn't there to give them hell directly, the Nether became the relative demon paradise it is now. Maybe that's the very reason all the piglins aren't undead now. Maybe while Abaddon was in power, all piglins were undead, because that's how damnation works here. And even if they tried killing themselves and respawning alive, it'd make no difference because Abaddon kept them undead. So the reason even now we see zombie piglins is likeliest because the wholeness of that hellness still resonates in them, so it has to wear thin again before they're able to respawn alive again. So of course with Abaddon, that never wore thin, so they were always stuck. That also explains why the Wither won't attack zombie piglins, or any undead really, because they're already cursedly reduced back to the hellish suffering they were supposed to have, and the other undeads are, well, dead. There's no reason to attack them. Maybe that's why live piglins will flee from the zombified ones, because they resonate with so much cursedness that, like with Abaddon, they could very well rub off on them and return them to their past truly damned state. Or so they believe at least. We never see it happen, but to me that makes more sense than actually anything else. Because they don't attack them, or anything, so it must be that curse thing. But also earlier I showed that Zoglin respawning as a live Hoglin, which unless the damned are different in that way from the demons, which there's no indication of, I guess I was wrong there? So yeah, they would still respawn as Zoglins like the piglins do, and furthermore they would also hypothetically naturally spawn in the Nether as well as the overworld. I also said last video that the Nether skeletons are also damned, and they originate in either Soul Sand Valleys or Nether fortresses. Those in Soul Sand Valleys are enduring a whole other degree of suffering than the Hoglins, having to coexist with soul-eating fire and many more less fortunate and very more sinful souls trapped in the sand, some having been there so long even their soul is eroded like the sand. Probably the degree of hell designated for exceedingly selfish people, bad enough to be stuck in the sand, but not bad enough to be the sand like the ones that are. Why the skeletons have bows though, just makes no sense. I think we can all agree they're are only in the soul sand valleys to complement the whole lifeless fossil theme, but there is absolutely no means why they should have a bow, or anything. I think they only have them because the devs wanted every skeleton everywhere to be the same, so letting them keep the bow only made sense, except that it doesn't. I would cast a vote to change them to the bowless version, though that would make them move at Mach 4, which I think is very okay, all things considered. Anyway, the nether skeletons that go to the fortresses are probably picked out by Abaddon because of their susceptibility to do the work to revive him with minimal complaints. I even said last video that it was probably the Wither that influenced the fortresses to be built, and now I'm saying it was Abaddon's idea because I just realized there's not just one Wither. Unless, obviously, if what I said earlier is accurate and it is just the Withers. Then it would have been their idea. Piglins, of course, knowing what's up in the nether fortresses, would want no more Wither problems and try to prevent any more the best they can, as I said earlier. Anyway, it's probably the more withered skeletons that build new fortresses, because they're both stronger and less susceptible to fire, so they could build those supports in the Lake of Fire better than the newer ones could. Then they also summon blazes to give extra security to the fortresses. Now I'm gonna kinda go back on something from last video again, and that is blazes are not demons. They're manifestations of hellfire made live with black magic, which makes sense because black magic comes from hell, and they're in it. Setting-wise, not literally. Stop taking it that way. Even when I made the last video and said they were demons, I thought it was a stretch. And that's just because I didn't even think of black magic then. And I'm allowed to have not thought of that and said something else, because that's what this whole video is about, and that is not what the last video was about. So I'm still okay here. Something more about the blazes is their blaze rods. I think they're the instrument that keeps them going, and probably what also lets them channel that hellfire the way they do. When you hit a blaze, you're hearing the weapon collision with the blaze rods. So maybe the way one dies is because the rods were damaged enough that it can't sustain it anymore. And we know how blaze powder is used in brewing, as is nether wart. Makes sense they'd be doing some of that stuff in the nether fortresses, seeing as there are rooms here and there with patches of nether wart obviously configured to be farmed. And since they've got the ready availability of blaze powder, they can quite easily be brewing stuff. But we see no brewing stands in the fortresses. To me, this supposes they brew some other way, a much cruder, probably less efficient way than we do. Of course, they don't have to worry about inefficiency much because they literally have an infinite supply of blaze powder. And again about the damned mobs, before anyone says,
You say ghasts are damned and damned are undead, but ghasts aren't undead, so they can't be damned.
that's because they're resemblant of abominable ghosts. Ghastly ghosts, if you will. Though seriously, that's undoubtedly what they had in mind making that name. Though they may not be counted as undead by the game, they are definitely dead enough to be damned. If the devs at the time didn't have damned souls in mind while making it, I cannot imagine what. Same with soul sand, unquestionably. So let's just safely assume it's canon, no? Also, side note, I meant to say in the last video but forgot, ghasts are full of brimstone to go with the fire they are also full of, because of the gunpowder they drop. Gunpowder is chemically made of mostly carbon and sulfur, which is the same as brimstone. I think the devs at the time may have meant for it to be completely brimstone but wanted to stay subtle, because after all, what other reason would they have to do that? Plus, gunpowder was actually called sulfur for a time. So when you think about it that way, that the ghasts are quite literally spitting balls of fire and brimstone, plus everything else, you realize they are pretty much embodiments of damnation. Back on track, after all is said and done, why the piglins would still stay at the Bastion ruins even after the whole conflict? I say cause as battle damaged as it is, it's great protection from what threats there are relevant now, which are very little, except probably some unforeseen player. Maybe, maybe not. Perhaps it's just good to reminisce to the days those were. Maybe it's just the places the legates designated to be their main bases. Who knows? All we know is that's where they've decided to stay. You could also say the bastions are instead figurative references to whatever conflict in the heavens that made demons fallen angels, completely negating what I said about the Wither's correlation to it, but that further fails to explain why they hate Wither skeletons. So that's my story and I'm sticking to it, unless another update comes along and wrecks that one too. Before people comment that I admitted it's a fanfiction, that is not a fanfiction, it's lore. Fanfiction would be saying the Wither dodged a bullet and it was instead a war on the returned undead piglins, something there is zero indication of, and potentially other aspects contradict. The Wither is at least a plausible theory. Now that the bigger threat is over now, piglins can leave the bastions and continue on normal life, searching for damned souls to eat and more gold for their insatiable avarice. After gold, maybe that crap we call netherite. Maybe let's go ahead and mine out the entire nether of it, leave none for anyone else, though not like there ever was or will ever be. Wait, who the hell is that? Oh, Lucifer, it's someone else, with a ruined portal that is not yet ruined. Speaking of the ruined portals, piglins, realizing they were able to leave the nether, but at a terrible price, probably imagined that as long as they were still counted in hell, they'd suffer nil side effects of leaving the nether. This led to stuff like plans to convert what's outside of the nether into the nether so they could finally escape. Unfortunately, this was soon realized to be extremely counterproductive, and with no other way around the curse, wasn't given much further thought, until eventually, inevitably, the portals were abandoned. And also, if you think it's stupid, my explanation that all the netherite in the whole nether was all mined out by the piglins Hoglins, and now all we've got are the scraps, this is actually canon, so you can't blame me for that one. In which case, those were the days could probably also mean the times of netherite before so much of it was lost somehow, though not all, cause what they have left is kept safe in the bastions, further reason why they don't want anyone robbing them. Of course, it doesn't mean that. The achievement is got from entering a bastion, not getting netherite. But that doesn't mean that couldn't be why those were the days. Meanwhile, another thing happened since the fall of the Wither. Since it freed up more space for life to happen, damned life of course, but still, ecological succession could happen in certain places, with high scale enough funguses on high scale enough masses of dead matter. I'm of course talking about those crimson forests, or crimson fungal mass forest equivalents. Of course, that fungus is netherwort, or at least a subspecies of netherwort, because the smaller fungus equivalent is not the netherwort as we know, but the foliage is confirmed netherwort. Netherwort, as we all know, normally grows on soul sand. That means, since netherwort is certainly a fungus, and since fungus is the decomposer, we can safely assume netherwort is a soul-eating fungus. And that mass of dead matter is of course the whole nether, which I said last video and I'll say it again, is the deadest place in the universe, if it even is in the universe. At least hell isn't. The nether may or may not be, which if it's live enough to even have fungus, which pure death cannot, implies it quite is exclusive Minecraft hell and within the universe. Basically hell that's shed the whole hell part, ever since they rid the withers. And of course, the regular netherwort feeds directly off dying souls in the soul sand, but the different crimson funguses feed off the soul death that fills the whole nether, specifically in this case the raw netherrack. Like I said last video too, has dead blood in it anyway. Like I said then as well, that just like soul fungus eats souls like normal fungus eats dead matter, soul fire burns souls like normal fire burns matter, which explains why piglins avoid it, so they don't get burned, because they're still just a damn soul. Why they would ever build a bastion in the soul sand valleys though, I guess times got extra rough then. These crimson forests being filled with life, or at least the livest thing you can find in hell, is good news for the hoglins. They're perpetually hunted by the piglins, which the forest provides obstacles for them rather than the openness of the other biomes. And they can also eat the soul-eating fungus, because having lived mortally, they're used to eating, and no thanks to Abaddon for preventing them from doing that. Piglins, seeing the abundance of hoglins here, were most likely quick to come back to the crimson forest, with their about zero disadvantages for them. Ever since the forest came up, more hoglins would flock here to avoid piglins, because there was more to remind them of what used to be their home. That means they used to live in the wastes and other places before the convenience of the crimson forests. And like the hoglins went, the piglins followed as well. Fun fact, the name of the song that plays in the crimson forest, Chrysopoeia, translates from Greek to making of gold. It is also the alchemical word for the process of turning stuff into gold. Oh, shoot. Now they're gonna think I just copied that knowledge from here. No, I actually did look that information up myself. I'm smart like that. Now about hoglin breeding. What and why are the new bred hoglins? It makes sense while Abaddon was in power. All damned souls were the adult zoglins rather than brought in by hoglins breeding like it is now. It's certainly a sort of reincarnation. If for whatever reason there were no more souls to be damned, it'd probably mean no more hoglins would spawn, except for those respawning. But come on, let's not be stupid. There'll always be plenty of souls to be damned. Just look around. So how about those striders? What the heck are they? Why do they exist? Why do they get hypothermia outside the lake of fire? What ungodly conditions would happen that the only thing that can keep them warm enough is hellfire, the hottest fire in the not universe? I say the striders are an accumulation of all the organic matter and nasty witchcraft that's fallen into the lava, plus the evil forces of hell that fill the nether, like black magic, infused into it. Over time, that well-done matter becomes quickened by the black magic, remaking cellular growth and bringing it to life. This new Frankenstein-like life entity of primordial soup flambe is made adapted enough to the hellfire, such that it can only survive in it. To me, it doesn't make sense that it'd be either a demon or a damned soul, because it's very chill, definitely not literally. It's very neutral, I mean. It probably doesn't even have a brain, or nothing noteworthy. That's why I say it's animated by witchcraft, but it probably doesn't even know that. It probably barely even cares too that some undamned and relatively frigid entity from above would write it, just as long as they're getting the foreign taste of warped fungus that they're after. Maybe striders are the nether fish. Maybe there are fish in the nether. Remember to put that part in the next out of context compilation video. So how about those endermans? Why do they have a whole version of that crimson forest to themselves when they're supposed to live in the end? And why are they now more common in the nether than they are in the overworld? I remember a time when endermen spawned exclusively in the end and overworld, and never in the nether. I also recall the only reason endermen ever came into the overworld, and nether even, was because it was just some place in the vast universe for them to take material from. But I guess the developers are trying to force it down its players' throats that all that is relevant to the game is what they show to you, and I guess I can't complain. It is canon after all. Lore, however, does have to agree with all other aspects in and of itself, like that the Nether is indeed resembling hell, but there's nothing directly saying that Endermen do or do not go beyond the Minecraft dimensions. Like I said before, the Endermen could go anywhere in the universe, which until they say otherwise, that still may be the case, and that could make everything in the universe technically relevant to the game, but only from an Enderman's perspective. But since we're not Endermen, the devs made the whole game revolve around the player, because that'd be easier to digest than the few extra steps it'd take to understand things from the in-game character's perspective. So now the only way I can sensibly explain why there's more Endermen in the Nether than the overworld is just because of the lack of water. It might seem dumb, but it's a little more valid than you may initially think. And also, really, what other reason would they have? Enderman's species is evidently weak against water, whether it be because of their biological composition or something else simply too strange for an unfamiliar mind like ours to understand. Although the overworld may just be better in every way, it's literally pouring with water, making the Nether a safer working environment, relatively speaking. And I'm not meaning hell as in damnation, because they're not damned. I mean the setting, which is the Nether, which they can come and go as they please, just like the player, as neither of them are damned, like I said before. And they're clearly planning to stay there rather than the overworld, because they've already terraformed, warped even, parts here and there of several crimson forests to suit the environment they're used to, whether intentionally or just on accident from the forest's prolonged exposure to them. I mean, we wouldn't tell the difference in the end, because it's already suited to the Enderman standards, and it's not the Enderman suited to the end, because be that the case, they would have morphed into a whole other species in the Nether, or done absolutely nothing to the forests. Instead, the forests were the ones to adapt to them. Well, not adapt, modified. Then that raises the question, was the end ever someplace way different invaded by the Endermen that over time they changed the whole scape of, like what's happening in the warped forest? Or maybe it was actually the Ender Dragon, which came and changed the land on its own, which would make the higher species the Ender Dragon and not the Enderman, because unless they were two different but biologically similar species living in different places that the Ender Dragon invaded, that would make the Endermen the evolved victims of the place the End used to be before it became what it is now. And like the Ender Dragon, it's been long enough that they can also terraform land just by being there long enough. To me, both hypothetical theories make sense, the Enderman having always been one unevolved species, at least as far as the game plot is concerned, and the Ender Dragon is another that invaded and is now the tyrannical ruler of, and the other theory implying the End was once someplace else that the Ender Dragon alone invaded and terraformed itself, and the Endermen are the evolved living victims. However, the prior one makes more sense to me, though they're both sensible. They could definitely have both been biologically similar, but definitely different races living in other places. Just like here, we have biologically similar species that are still vastly different, and just like humans are the dominant race here, the Ender Dragon, or dragons even, would be the dominant race of the End biology species, unless there's something else we don't know about. That theory also makes sense because I couldn't imagine how or why any other race would be living on a random rock in an infinite and very end-suitable void. Like, unless some absolutely horrific disaster happened and now all that's left is this one End asteroid and all the End City asteroids around it, plus a complete overhaul of the surrounding void, which now is very endy. It just seems like too much to have happened that somehow everything turned around from any other environment into this. Unless there so happens to be another alien race that, like Enderman, lives on a levitating rock in a void filled with End particles, but is not Enderman. So after that explanation, the second theory loses its realistic possibility, and that means the End has always looked the way it does now, except it probably didn't get those pillars until after the Ender Dragon arrived, because why else would they need them? So back to the Nether update lore, if Endermen are mostly using worlds with no water like the Nether, what purpose would they ever have to go to wet worlds like the overworld? To that I say, maybe because the overworld is like 8 times bigger than the Nether, which means a lot more resources for them to swipe, and it's quite accessible anyway, just one 4th dimensional shift is all it takes for them, and getting back to the right spot shouldn't be too hard unless they go super far away, and even then they only gotta go an 1/8 of the distance. But still, it's just wet enough that not more would jump on board with the idea. Maybe all of that's not true. Maybe sometimes it just gets too hot in the Nether. Maybe it really is because they're literally in a branch of hell, filled with fire, death, and other scary crap. Speaking of which, you know what I think is confusing? Piglins can barter out water bottles, despite the proven and reproven lack of water in the Nether. The only way this could make sense is if that's not actually water, but fungus juice. Of course, with a vast similarity, the player will see it and use it as water, like it does with so many other things. Like that horse armor they find in fortress chests, or that gunpowder, actually brimstone that drops from gas. The list goes on. Now before anyone else says,
well, no, the Nether isn't hell, it's just a cave really deep underground.
Have you never heard maybe the biggest connotation of hell after fire and brimstone? The connotation with the underworld? That the hellscape is actually really deep underground? The literal reason why it's called the underworld, and this realm is called the overworld? Literally? Of course with Minecraft, it's not so much the case. Not so literal. The last thing you see underground is bedrock, and under that bedrock is the void, which which is just space, not the Nether. Even canonically, the 3 accessible Minecraft dimensions are not in any defined location where they are relative to the overworld, though we may think of the Nether as below and the end as above, but it could just not be that way. And I'm not gonna get into is the overworld round or flat, because that's just something else for another day. Spoilers, it's flat. Now the Nether is certainly connected to the overworld because of the octuple travel distance, but evidently not physically below it. So that means the we need to go deeper achievement/advancement isn't referring to the literal positioning of the Nether realm, wherever it be, rather than the simple underworld connotation. How the underworld and overworld are connected by the octuple distance thing is likeliest because the Nether is 8 times smaller, like I said before, and it has to put the portal between them in the right relative position just because of that. If you were to think of the Nether portals as having gravity to each other, it also explains why you couldn't put 2 too close. 2 or more next to each other would still turn back to the first portal like gravity and not creating another one. But putting a portal in a place far enough from the first one will create another portal because it's not affected as much by the portal gravity as I guess I'm calling it. Still, you can hopefully understand what I mean. Now back on the topic of Endermans, remember in the other video how I was talking about how now Endermans can't despawn while holding a block? I still think it's very cheesy of the devs to do that, but I can technically see why they did that for player convenience, so they wouldn't have to replace the single block they took out, but by that same logic, they may as well just altogether remove creepers. Little problem with that too, that they'd have to drop whatever carried block before leaving. That little problem I noticed personally when playing the game myself, that there was a hugely significant increase in random blocks appearing and disappearing, sometimes some blocks appearing in places they shouldn't, like a random grass block in a super deep cave or gravel somewhere on the grassy surface, those kinds of things. And who's to blame for that? Less Enderman than the mad developers. I prefer just losing the block forever than having to put it back for them. Thanks for the non-existent player convenience, Micro Jang. So then I think, did they actually do that just to intentionally make them more annoying? If so, it worked out splendidly, but why? Why would you do that? Why would you do any of that? So, how about those basalt deltas? I think they're supposed to represent literal fire and brimstone, as in igneous rocks, not at all associated with hell and damnation. Basalt is the commonest igneous rock, which I guess is why they chose that one to represent such a biome. This one produces a lot more magma cubes than the other biomes. Why? Sensibly because there's a lot more elements suitable for magma cubes to form. Also, to clarify, magma cubes aren't demons either, but not live by black magic either. They're by canon the Nether equivalent of slimes, of course instead made of molten rocks, and probably not minding or even aware that they're in Minecraft hell. So they're a huge wildcard in the Nether. And since the basalt deltas are referencing literal magma like the magma cubes are, it makes sense they go together too. Probably what makes them alive like slime does in overworld slimes is the magma cream. Clearly not the whole thing is magma cream, or we'd have such an abundance of it upon killing one. So it's probably what allows them to bond with more magma, implying why their max size is so limited. And synthesis to make more cream only happens when there's enough magma for that. And like I said earlier, the basalt deltas are just the right environment for them to develop. I think it's worth mentioning, magma cubes and blazes are canonly related. Not only can you make imitation magma cream using blaze powder, apparently according to the mob bestiary, that's not imitation, it's the real thing. So I guess the Nether fortresses got their material for blazes from magma cream, also explaining why magma cubes spawn in them more commonly. Another thing I think is worth mentioning, slimes are sometimes associated with ghosts. If that's the case with Minecraft, magma cubes really would sensibly be some damned soul, further explaining why they have spawners and bastion remnants, unless that's just because the bastions are made of the same stuff as the basalt deltas. You know, I've realized every new Nether biome is resemblant of some sort of thing represented in hell. The Nether wastes represent the stereotypical hellscape of fire and brimstone, the soul sand valleys represent damnation and suffering, the crimson forests represent the new life from death, so it's just a Minecraft thing, and the basalt deltas represent literal fire and brimstone, completely unassociated with damnation. So what about the warped forest? It's clearly not natural, but from a reason for adding it at all, maybe, just maybe, this biome represents fear. That makes sense with Endermans too, since the biome is full of them. Not to mention, the biome produces a whole lot of pretty messed up sounds. We see Endermen as silly, elongated, dark, and purple humanoids, but inside the game, you can tell they're made out as probably the scariest mob in existence. Maybe they know something we don't. Maybe their biology simply is too strange for us to comprehend, and thus the in-game scientists are completely boggled how a creature like this can exist, and they may never know. It puts in perspective the fear of the unknown. So that's pretty much everything which I said contradicted the prior game lore. Now explained how that lore is since the update. About everything else they added was the developers spoiling their players. Like really, who really needs netherite? Or a respawn anchor? Or targets? Though I will admit, the game lore is a ton more interesting since the update, but I still terribly disagree with it. Why? Not only did they kinda screw over game veterans, both ones like me who still believed in diamond armor, and a much vaster majority who hated the lore-breaking replacement job they did. What I mean by replacing is the former zombie pigmans that are now zombie piglins. Think of the updates as historian work. As a historian, you start out with what you initially have, and as more things are discovered, discovered, in this case as more updates happen, you add to that found history, in this case the lore, and correct anything that needs correction since those discoveries. Lore searching should be the same way, which is the very thing that's supposed to keep canon creators continuous with their lore. They should not cross any lines. Every new update can be explained from a historian view of it was always there, but only now it was discovered, which is technically true even from in the game. A new world in that update is kind of like an alternate timeline where crap in the update was always a thing. Even if you go into an outdated world in an updated version, undiscovered chunks will have those things from the new update. Everything is technically continuous. But with 1.16 replacing zombie pigmans and completely overwriting their history is completely impossible from a historian view and entirely not okay from a lore searching view, because that history already was, and now something that never was the first time replaces it. It's like altering the past. Historians don't go back in time and do that. That doesn't happen, which is why it's so wrong to cross lines like that. Like, even if I were wrong in everything, this affects everybody. Nobody's story holds up because this is unfortunately canon, so everyone has to bend to it whether or not the devs did the right thing. I also know that problem, the one with Microjang submitting so many irrelevant fan ideas, practically giving the same feel as a mod everyone is forced to play if they want to keep up on the times, which it kinda is a fan mod at this point because of most, or at least a great chunk of additions being stupid suggestions from lore-ignoring fanboys. That problem is even worse than the 1.17 Caves and Cliffs update, but I'm saving that for its own video. And yes, I know I should have done that one first, especially seeing as that update is out now, but I really wanted to make this one, and it took exceedingly much longer to make than I expected. So sorry about that, but I promise the second right after publishing this one, I'll get right to work on that one. Promise. And just because I said I'm overall okay with the update besides the zombie pigman situation, I don't want to see a single comment like, "I told you so," because I wasn't thinking over that lore in the last video. That wasn't what it was about. I'll admit it was primarily for complaining. So I made this one to satisfy whoever was looking for that explanation. Just for you, sweetie. Anyway, that's the end of this one. Still, the most brainless change I can think of is the changes to the serious dedication advancement. Still, it no longer requires any which sort of serious dedication, making the whole name of it complete bull. Now you just need to craft one, and apparently that's serious dedication enough. You don't need to use it up or anything like it used to be, which used more than a single degree of dedication at least. Now just craft it, and you're somehow called committed enough to call it that. I know I talked about the lunacy in this in the last VID, but I just have to get across how absolutely despicable this change is. These days I'll be actually using up a diamond or netherite hoe and giving myself the advancement with commands, as I recommend everyone else do, because this is just stupid, but whatever. Anyway, you can count on me talking about all the same sort of stuff in my video about update 1.17, both the lore and why Microjang shouldn't do this. And just from what I've seen already, the upcoming game lore is looking kinda grim.